Hello, good morning. This is, you're tuning into my fourth Monday morning missive. This is about the module 4 of my musical history teaching aid. And I have a stuffed up head, but that's okay. I was born a refugee, and I don't know if I'll ever see the old farmhouse I've heard about, but it's where I belong, there is no doubt. My whole family is from that farm. We never did nobody harm. And if you're confused by what you've heard, let me boil it down to a single word. I want to go home. I want to go home. I have heard my grandpa say that on the street most every day the neighbors' kids would kick a ball with my dad when he was small. We were Christians, they were Jews, but it was no big deal, religious views. So it was strange when at the point of a gun across the river we had to run. I want to go home. I want to go home. We had Death Cake, we had songs, and we all knew where we belonged. We grew crops, life was good there in the land where Jesus stood. Now we're scattered everywhere, but there's no peace anywhere. And I'm just searching for some kind of sign, for some way back to Palestine. I want to go home. 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 So the fourth module of my musical history teaching aid basically covers the post-World War II era through the late 60s, which of course is, as usual, a lot of ground to cover and doesn't cover most of it, but just a few little salient episodes. And that last song is about certainly one of the most well-known events to have taken place in the sort of immediate post-Second World War period, which characterizes in many ways a lot of what has been happening for a very long time, which in many continents, countries throughout the world, which is the process of people through one means or another moving from wherever they're from to somewhere else, and then imposing their will on the local population and taking over. This process happens for many reasons in many different situations. You know, and in some situations, well, especially when you look back far enough, it can seem like a sort of an organic process, like that happens as resources are scarce in one area and not scarce in another area, and that sort of thing. And of course, there's all kinds of ways to look at it that way, especially when you take the really broad historical view. But when you're getting close up especially when we're talking about things that really never needed to happen, then and especially when, well, when it's all so recent and in the, we can see it. It's living memory. It's stuff that we can see around us and in film and all sorts of forms. And to me, the whole question of what happened in Palestine after that in 1947, 48, around then, is and really it had been going on. It had been building for a long time, and then in many ways the story continued in all kinds of horrible ways after that. But in many ways, this episode of history is so iconic for so many people in so much of the world, and it is so iconic because it has so much to do with the rest of us, like all the Anglo settler countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the process of theft and annexation and occupation that took place in all of these countries. Of course, and then also many other similar stories like the Russian expansion into the east, from Moscow towards the eastern end of Siberia. This was also a colonial project of displacing indigenous people and taking over and running things. But what happened? Oh, and by the way, if people want to share this broadcast on Facebook, tell people it's happening and stuff, then that would be much appreciated. So what happened? What happened in the starting in the 1890s was this European project called Zionism, which was a project of European Jews to move, as they say, back to the Holy Land, which is not, but there's nothing back about it because the vast majority of European Jews had nothing to do with the Holy Land in terms of their family history when their family converted to Judaism and all that sort of thing. But there was this religious idea about going back to the Holy Land, which was exploited by this Zionist movement for various reasons in order to colonize Palestine. And a lot of different players in the game had different reasons to support the colonization and sort of conquest of Palestine. This had been going on for a very long time, really for 1,000 years in one form or another, in terms of the Europeans trying to conquer the Holy Land. Generally in the past it had been European Christians launching crusades to go conquer other people's land. But and there were reasons why the crusades happened at the time they did. The Germans and Scandinavians had all just become Christian, and there were famines going on, and both of those things were happening. So those were two factors involved, but there were, after in the wake of the Second World War, there were millions and millions of refugees, primarily in Europe. There were millions of ethnic Germans who had been part of this whole settling of Russia during the 19th century, along with lots of Russians. And these German speakers in places like Russia had to leave after the war and flee for their lives. And there were lots and lots of other refugees all over Europe who were displaced as a result of the war. And but the unusual aspect of the settling of Palestine was that one of the ways that the refugee problem was dealt with in Europe was by giving Jews the opportunity, you could say, to move to Palestine. Because, well, for one thing, countries like the United States made it very difficult for refugees, Jewish or others, to move to the United States. And up until 1944, which was when the quota was lifted. So people desperately had to find somewhere else to go. And of course, after the war, more people went because it was also it was a place they could go. And of course, for many of them, there was also a belief that they needed to have their own country. But of course, when they got there, oftentimes they realized, as some of the original Zionist explorers in the 1890s realized when they saw Palestine, as one of the first people that Herzl sent over in, I think it was in the 1890s, he sent a telegram saying, the bride is beautiful, but she's married. In other words, there are already people here. But that didn't stop the European invaders. That usually doesn't stop them. It just slows them down. And the effort to conquer Palestine had been going on for, as I mentioned, 1,000 years, on and off. But this time, in the wake of the First World War and the division of the Ottoman Empire by the Western powers, in 1947, with the Zionist movement increasing the number of people moving and then declaring Israel to be a state, this was the sort of culmination of this process of settling Palestine. And it kind of bore a lot of similarities to the settlement of Western states in the United States, because it was kind of like in Western states in the U.S., when they were settled by enough white people, then they became then basically once there was a majority of white people in a place like a state, or a territory, that's when they had the opportunity to declare themselves a state and join the United States. The United States wouldn't have any states joining them, and that didn't have a white majority. And in Palestine, the Israeli settlers, the Zionists, have used much the same kind of reasoning. They can have a Muslim Arab minority within Israel as long as it's a minority, and can't have any serious political power. But of course, the majority of the population overall, if you include the West Bank and Gaza, is actually Palestinian. But that's why they don't get to vote or have citizenship or anything like that. So, by the way, comments and questions are most welcome, as always. Not one comment so far, so I'm kind of wondering, are people out there are you able to comment? Am I not seeing comments because they're just, I don't know. I assume commenting is something that can be done if you wanted to. Oh, show live chat. I had it on hidden, did I? Hide? No, I don't want to hide. Okay. Chat hidden. No, I don't want to do that. Okay. Okay, chat is not hidden. So I think you can say something if you want to. Not that you have to. So, moving on, as we do in this sort of discombobulated historical presentation. As I've mentioned before in past presentations, I'm just skipping around, in these in these presentations on these broadcasts, rather than trying to cover all the ground that I'm covering in the history teaching aid. I'm just covering little bits and pieces, because I don't want to make these broadcasts too long. And so this is moving a little bit up to the early 1950s. Throughout the Second World War, the Allies managed to unite in a broad front against fascism. But once they won this fight, the ruling class convened with McCarthy in the lead to make sure the people got in line, to be sure they all took heed, to make sure they understood our new enemies were not the Japanese or Germans, but the Russians and Chinese, and all those who supported them, the enemy within, such as all the communists and any of their kin. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. There was a war on in Korea with untold thousands dead. On one side the USA, on the other side the Reds. The Russians got the bomb, there must be someone to blame, and their siblings and their spouses must be in on the game. Against one man they had evidence, nothing on his wife. They'd arrest her anyway and threaten to take her life, to try to make her husband snitch on someone up the chain, to instill the fear of the committee's terroristic reign. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. Watch out for your neighbors. Be careful who you know, or you might be called to testify. You might have to go in front of the committee, where it will be assumed you're guilty as charged by every juror in the room. You can join the blacklist or watch out for what you say. Beware of who you talk to, or you might also see the day when you're called to Congress to be questioned by the ones with the power to decide if you should be taken from your sons. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. So says the ghost of Ethel Rosenberg. The Rosenbergs were executed by electric chair in 1953 in Massachusetts, and they were Julius Rosenberg was a spy for the Soviet Union, and Ethel, his wife, was not, and may not have known that he was a spy either, but they and the government knew that Ethel was not a spy, but they charged both of them with sharing nuclear secrets with the Soviets, and even though they knew that she was innocent, and they were trying to get Julius to talk by charging her as well, but they were both committed communists, and neither one of them talked, and they were both killed. And this episode was one of these things that the United States government was looking for. Not that they had to try that hard to find one, but you know, they wanted to have opportunities to make sure that people understood that we were not friends with the Reds anymore. Remember that during the Second World War, there was this anomalous period in U.S. history where the United States made an alliance, as did the UK and other countries, made an alliance with the Soviet Union as well as China. I mean, of course, this was before the Chinese Revolution, but there was a lot of communists involved in China who were allies with, you know, in the war against Japan. And the U.S. made this alliance, but this is an anomalous thing. Normally, the U.S. was not allied with communists and was, in fact, allied, as I talked about a bit in the last segment, with fascists. And the United States still supports fascists all over the world, and still does not support communists anywhere, and still tends to equate the two with each other in order to confuse people. And so you had a situation where after the Second World War, the Red Scare, I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of amazing that it was such a big thing, that they put so much energy into it, into Joe McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee, and all these efforts to blacklist and imprison people and humiliate them as much as possible. This whole campaign was happening in the context of a situation where the general state of affairs was not one very conducive for communist activists trying to change society to become more egalitarian, less cutthroat capitalistic, less imperialistic, more cooperative. People like the Rosenbergs, who had these beliefs about how things should be. What's interesting, I think, and particularly, is the extent to which people like the Rosenbergs were considered to be such a big threat by the U.S. authorities. Because, of course, in a period like during the Depression, in the 30s, it's understandable. Why are they scared of the communists? Because the communists were putting millions of people on the streets, and were controlling much of the labor movement, and were a serious force to be reckoned with. But this was not the case in the late 40s and the 50s in the United States. Certainly it was the case in many other countries, like ones that the United States was bombing into complete destruction, like Korea, where, as with many other countries, the communist movement there was very popular, had a lot of popular support, and the U.S. dealt with that growing popular sovereign movement by destroying the country and killing at least 2 million civilians and bombing every building that was standing in the country, and bombing dams and drowning tens of thousands of people. The U.S. responded with a basically genocidal war against the people of Korea for having so many communists and wanting to do things differently than the capitalist countries wanted them to. This is what the United States did with, and Britain did with, all the countries that were not part of the Soviet bloc. That the Soviet Union had they had this agreement, which countries the Soviet Union was allowed to dominate, and those did not include South Korea, and they did not include Greece or Italy or various other countries, which the United States and Britain sent in lots of troops and lots of money to destroy communist movements in those countries. Of course, Korea being a whole scale of destruction that was, on a whole different scale from what happened in Italy and Greece when the U.S. sent troops there to kill communists. Or the U.S. sent British troops to kill communists. But, and the reason why in the U.S. At that time communism was not a big force in society, one of the reasons was because in the immediately post-war period, 50% of global industrial production was in the United States. So the U.S. economy was, there was pretty much full employment, good union work for any able-bodied person. And that's probably not accurate. Any able-bodied white man and a lot of other people could get good union jobs. And but that was the situation. And so the Red Scare was quite a dramatic response to a situation where there really wasn't much to be scared of in the U.S. at the time, in terms of Reds, and a time when the U.S. was able to offer its working class majority citizens prosperity, capitalist prosperity. You know, it was a form of prosperity that was very artificial because it was based on the total destruction of several of the world's major industrial countries. And of course, once they started getting back on their feet, rebuilding, you know, in Germany, Japan, Britain, Russia, then, you know, the U.S. had less dominance in terms of global industrial production. Yeah, so where was I going to go next? It is kind of weird not having comments, because my guess is that people might be commenting and I'm just not seeing their comments. So if that's the case, I'm sorry. But YouTube was working pretty well until now. And I noticed Paula shared this post, so I'm sure that means Paula is one of those people watching. And Paula, you probably would have commented when I said something about commenting, if you were able to. So I assume people are unable to comment, and I don't know why I'm not seeing the comments. I'm sure I could figure it out, but maybe on YouTube, on the computer. Let's see, what is my YouTube channel doing on the computer? It does not tell me I'm broadcasting. Let's see. I go to my channel, and it says I'm live now. And there's lots of comments. Okay. Okay. Okay, we're going to have an awkward period of silence while I'm looking at these comments. Okay, good. I'm glad that you're able to comment, and most of the comments were basically people reinforcing what I was saying about how horrible the U.S. war on Korea was, and yeah. And thank you for that, and I'm glad people are out there not only listening but also commenting. For some reason, it makes me feel validated. It makes me feel like a fully human person somehow. See, on the stage, when I start saying stupid things, I can just start singing a song. You know, you can just avoid saying anything dumb. Or, you know. Were playing on the radio, the Beatles were singing Love Me Do. Lolita was playing in the cinemas, it was October 1962. Ken Kesey published One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, John Glenn orbited the Earth. Australia had just won the most gold medals at the Commonwealth Games in Perth. The boomers were just getting into high school. Dylan first sang Blowing in the Wind. The U.S. Army had just started their war against the Viet Minh. On the day Vasily saved the world. If I Had a Hammer was in the Billboard charts. An Air Force jet crashed into the sea. The first black student had been admitted to Ole Miss University. Hewlett-Packard sold a personal computer, but it wouldn't really take off for a while. Jackie had just come back from a trip to India. Plunging necklines were the latest summer style. Algeria had just won their independence. Korea was rebuilding from the war. The Russian River had just flooded a couple of weeks before. The day Vasily saved the world. The CIA was running Operation Mongoose, killing Cubans in their factories and streets. The U.S. was making plans for an invasion, still smarting from the Bay of Pigs defeat. The Soviets had sent missiles to Havana to protect themselves and their Cuban friends. Then the U.S. Navy blockaded Cuba's harbors, and there was no telling how this thing would end. Khrushchev got on TV to make it very clear, Cuba is a sovereign state. If our ships are attacked, we will retaliate. On the day Vasily saved the world. Vice Admiral Vasily Arkhipov was standing at his post on a Soviet Navy submarine. They were on patrol in international waters, one actor in a terrifying scene. They were out of radio contact deep beneath the water when the sub began to shake and crack. The captain said, "Arm the nuclear torpedoes. We're under attack." The Americans were bombing them, but in order to respond, 3 officers had to give the go. 2 were in agreement, but for some reason, the Vice Admiral said no. On the day Vasily saved the world. On the day Vasily saved the world. That's what happens when you're sick. Your voice can sound great for about 1 song. Then it stops sounding so great. So, yeah, so that song is basically about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was another major event of the period. And you know, it really shows the Cuban Missile Crisis. One thing that it demonstrated to the world, and certainly to the Soviets, was that the leadership in the United States was crazy enough to risk the deaths of most of the people in their country and ultimately the world, you know, in order to make a political point. The idea that the United States was threatened by the Soviet Union having missiles in Cuba any more than the Soviets were already threatened by the United States having missiles in Turkey, which everybody knew it did at the time already, which is right near the Soviet Union. The idea that this was, the idea that the United States was going to, or that the Soviet Union was going to attack the U.S. was it was a fantasy. It was never a realistic notion. But the idea that the U.S. might attack the Soviets had a lot of historical precedent, because the United States had invaded Russia before, for example, not long before, and after the Russian Revolution. So, and the U.S. was full of all this anti-Soviet rhetoric, and was surrounding the Soviet Union with missiles, and so the Soviets were responding by putting missiles in Cuba, and this response of the U.S. government was to attempt to start World War III. And it wasn't a full-on assault. They could have tried a lot harder to start World War III. But what the U.S. Navy did was send depth charges, which are explosives, down to this Soviet submarine outside of, in international waters, not that far from Cuba. And the United States and the world knew, because Khrushchev had been at the UN on TV recently, explaining that international waters are international waters, and if the United States tries to stop Soviet ships from traveling in international waters, that they will respond to this act of war, which is what embargoes are. So what happened was the U.S. was bombing this sub, and the people the commanders in the sub, two of the three commanders, wanted to do what Khrushchev had said they were going to do, which is attack back if attacked, defend themselves if attacked. Everybody knew this was meant, what was meant by defending yourself when a nuclear armed submarine is under attack. What that means is you launch your missiles. And on that submarine, there were enough missiles to kill millions and millions of people in the United States. But one of the three commanding officers on the ship, on the sub, Vasily Arkhipov, said no. He refused. He didn't want to launch the missiles. So that's why we're still here today. And and the reason we are still here today, let us be absolutely clear. The reason we are alive today has absolutely nothing to do with John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy tried to kill 100 million Americans. He failed to do so because of Vasily Arkhipov. So, today when we talk about Trump and what a nutcase he is, he's got a lot of competition. In terms of leaders of the United States. So then, with all this craziness, all these genocidal wars in Korea, the genocidal war against Korea launched by the United States, millions of people dead, the Red Scare, vilifying communists around the world, constantly being on the brink of the Third World War, using all this horrible rhetoric to describe the Soviets and then the Chinese, building, this arms race historically, when there's arms races, the arms eventually get used. There was a huge arms race throughout Europe before World War One. I mean, lots of people predicted that there was going to be a big war because everybody was spending all the money on arms. So this was the atmosphere, and what's really remarkable is that after all the propaganda, all the wars, all the anti-communist stuff, all the prosperity, let's remember that this was a very prosperous period in the United States overall. In spite of all this, ultimately, the people in the United States by the mid to late 60s were many people were in a state of revolt. Ultimately, the next genocidal war that the United States tried to start, or did start, it turned out very similar to Korea in terms of the genocidal quality of it, in terms of killing millions of civilians. But in terms of cooperation on the part of the U.S. Military, that was not forthcoming to a large extent. In fact, most of the casualties in the Vietnam War on the American side were people falling out of planes and helicopters. The Vietnam War, contrary to depictions on the movies and stuff, was not primarily a war of grunts in the jungles fighting the Viet Cong. It was primarily an air war. It was primarily a war from the skies. And one of the reasons why the focus was on the air war was because by the late 60s, the soldiers in the U.S. military had largely refused to follow orders and were not fighting as they were told to. It's a story everyone should know. It happened a half century ago all across this sprawling nation. The rising of a generation started slow, then gained speed. Nobody knew where it would lead. First there were marches, then there were more. Way too many to keep score. They shut down classes, couldn't learn. Once they ascertained how napalm burned, they had to find out how to defy. People stood up, cause they couldn't stand by. There were parades held by the military brass. There were cities filled with CS gas. Real wars, war games, recruitment centers up in flames. Light a match, then in a flash, draft cards turned to ash. Thousands moved across the border, refusing military orders. Every army base in the USA had an anti-war cafe. There are times when you just can't comply. People stood up, cause they couldn't stand by. Soldiers insisted on free will, put down their guns, refused to kill. Newspapers of the underground ubiquitously could be found across the country, across the sea, throughout the ranks of the military. Take a grenade, pull out the pin. Praise be to Ho Chi Minh. Another fragging every night, a war that many refused to fight. Bombs were falling, some asked why. People stood up, cause they couldn't stand by. Classes with all their powers shook inside their ivory towers. They were brought to their knees back then. That's why we don't have the draft again. Even back then, some of them knew they had to be careful what they tried to do. Rulers who miscalculate lose control of their ship of state. In order to govern, you need consent, and all of that just up and went. In 68 came the reply. People stood up, cause they couldn't stand by. People stood up, cause they couldn't stand by. People stood up, cause they couldn't stand by. And let's see. Comments? Well, I can't remember. I can't figure out if the comments go up or down, but if anybody said anything recently, but anyway, I'll just keep going. And actually, that's I'm gonna conclude with that song, because I've been normally doing about 4 songs, and I can't really sing very well today. Hopefully by next week I'll be better. But that was a little snapshot of Module 4 of my musical history teaching aid, and I will be back next Monday, hopefully in a better condition to do another presentation with songs that will sound better and with spoken thoughts that will be slightly more coherent, because I feel like I have cobwebs in my brain. Yeah, I would say send your comments, and I can respond to them, except that it doesn't seem to be working. I'm looking over at my computer, and there's something wrong with the comments. Yeah, and then Kamala is saying she couldn't comment, so I don't know what's going on with the comments. Sorry about that. But comments or no, I'll be back to do this next week, and hopefully I'll figure out the comment problem, which has happened to me with every other live streaming platform I've used, and I didn't know it would happen here on YouTube, but it does. So it seems to be a glitchy thing that they all have the same problem with comments sometimes just not appearing. So there we go. 2017, 18, we need to improve the technology, but that'll probably always be the case. Actually, we should just get rid of it all and live in the trees. Thank you for listening, and if anybody out there is thinking about organizing a gig for me, perhaps, I mean, I don't know why you would be thinking about such things, but if you are, and you live in California or Texas, I will be there in March, and I would love to hear from you. And if you're in Europe, I will be there from mid-April till mid-June. All over Europe. I could play anywhere in Europe if somebody wants to organize a good gig. So let me know if that might be you. I'd love to hear from you. And keep on keeping on, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks for tuning in.